In this game, Aronian hands Carlsen probably the most spectacular defeat in his chess career. Aronian opens the game with pawn to d4. He's been a great d4 player in his career, although he has recently been trying e4. Now, we're going to get into a Chebenenko-Slav here after Carlsen chooses the sturdy pawn to a6 here on move 5. This is a really resilient system that has been popular and has a lot of theory, although we're not going to dive too deep into the theory in our review of the game. As we zip along, I will note that this is something that both players have prepared and have played before, and here on move 10, we get the first new move of the game, as Aronian plays bishop to c2, setting up his next idea. Carlsen plays the natural move rook to d8, which doesn't seem to anticipate what is coming next. Aronian now unveils his idea with pawn to a3. Now, one thing Aronian is amazing at, as I think are Topalov and Dubov, is preparation, opening preparation that uses computers but does not blindly trust them and instead challenges their evaluation. After pawn to a3, you could simply retreat here with bishop d6, although white gets a pleasant position here after breaking with pawn to e4. One move that you can't do is pull back with bishop a5, because then you have knight takes d5, and because of the attack on the now undefended bishop on a5, you win a pawn right here. So Carlsen actually goes ahead and after pawn to a3 accepts Aronian's pawn sacrifice and does play bishop takes a3, saying, all right, show me what you got right here. Now Aronian's next move is rook takes a3. This is a fantastic move. He's sacrificing an exchange and a pawn. What is he getting out of it? Well, after queen takes a3, pawn to c5 here, he's getting both tactical and positional compensation. So there are definitely ideas where the black queen gets trapped, but it's not forced. There's no guarantee that Aronian is trapping the queen, and even if he does trap the queen, in a lot of cases, Carlsen can get enough material back so that he's not even going to be better if he wins the black queen. In addition to these tactical ideas of trapping the queen, there's also just positional ideas. Black's pieces, especially these, and well, the queen that's in danger of getting trapped, are really unable to prosper in the coming position. So I think there's also just a lot of positional compensation. In this position, Carlsen decided to defend with pawn to b6. There's a lot of other possibilities here, partly because of the not forcing nature of the position. I will mention briefly that queen to a5, saying, hey, what if I just pull this queen back to a7 and you're still down that pawn in the exchange and I'll untangle eventually. This move loses because of knight takes d5, hitting the queen right here. So that's why the queen just can't get out of the box after c5 very easily. And here you can trade on f6 and then jump in here, and you've got a lot of ideas, including bishop to b1 here, that are going to trap the queen. So this actually wins according to analysis by Stockfish. The queen can't get out, which is pretty easy to see after you see knight takes d5. In terms of it's not something you want to walk into, knight takes d5 is just too strong. So in the game, Carlsen tries the move pawn to b6. Now, b6 is obviously trying to break apart this strong point on c5 and to get the bishop on c8 out of the game, hoping that both the queen can be freed and the other black pieces can be freed after c5 is broken down. Aronian now plays pawn to b4. This is a nice move with simple ideas. You're just keeping the queen boxed in and the black pieces unable to develop by keeping your strong pawn on c5. Now, if black captures here with queen takes b4, then you have knight takes d5, discovering an attack over here on the black queen, and if the queen moves, then you have at least 97 check, winning this pawn on c6, which gives you a really nice position as white here. Instead, what Carlsen did was after pawn to b4, he decided it's time to bail out. Things are getting too hot and heavy and I must free my position somehow. So he tries knight to e4. This gives a pawn immediately, and Aronian goes ahead and takes it. And it also allows Aronian some pressure here, but now thanks to the trade of knights, there's not so much risk that the queen is actually going to be physically trapped on the board. So after bishop takes e4 here, rather than passively try to defend this pawn on c6, we're going to get rook to b8, the most active defense from Carlsen, hoping to trade and activate the rook down the b file. At this point, Levon transitions to playing more for positional compensation and queen trapping ideas to a direct attack on the king. He now offers a Greek gift sacrifice with bishop takes h7 check. Of course, this idea is crazy famous, and almost every amateur player has encountered this sacrifice, whether on the winning or the losing side at some point. But this is particularly special. How often do you see a Greek gift sacrifice against a reigning world champion? It is so rare, and it's actually really hard to think of a prior example. Now, after bishop takes h7, we do get king captures h7 from Carlsen, as is usual. If you don't take the bishop, then your king is just exposed, and white's pieces are able to start flooding in through the sieve that is now your defenses. So having accepted the bishop sacrifice, we now get knight to g5 check from Aronian, and Carlsen picks king to g8. But the big question is, what happens if king to g6 instead? Initially, Stockfish thinks that king g6 is actually the best defense, but it is also winning for white. Now, the traditional follow-up and the correct follow-up here is queen to g4 when you're threatening all kinds of discoveries that will likely win material and lead to a checkmating attack against the black king. The problem that you always have to consider when you're going for these lines is, what about pawn to f5, giving the king some room to run and also attacking the undefended white queen? Here we can fall back with queen to g3, and although the king can try to escape by stepping over to f6, we have a very beautiful win here. There are a few winning lines, but the best, seen by Aronian, is pawn to d5. Now, this wins in a few different ways, all of them really, really special. First off, after pawn to d5, if you do c takes d5, then there's very nicely here pawn to c6, the knight is hit, and if it moves, there's pawn to c7, creating a fork where you're attacking both rooks, and you're going to pick one up and make a queen, which is just a lovely, lovely line. Alternatively, after pawn to d5, if we do get e takes here, then the problem is that the queen comes into d6 here with check, and the king is opened up on the third rank. The king can and must capture the knight, but then we have e4 check right here, and after the king moves, queen f4 is leading to checkmate here. There's simply no defense to the mating ideas. We're also attacking this undefended pawn here on f5. Really, really beautiful stuff. This d5 line is one of the best lines in the game, and it is so important to the success of Aronian's attack. Instead, after knight g5 check, Carlsen did fall back with king to g8, and the queen pours into h5. Of course, there's the ideas of invading both on h7 and on f7 here. h7 is the more important square to defend, and so you're looking at two knight moves. If you play knight to f8 here, then the problem is that queen takes f7 check, king over, queen to e7 simply traps the rook here on d8, winning material and winning the game easily. Therefore, Carlsen picked the correct move after queen h5, knight to f6, attacking the queen and defending h7. Of course, you must now take here on f7 with check, and the king moves over to h8, the only legal move. Now, after queen c7, this is where Aronian's analysis basically stopped after bishop takes h7 check. He calculated up to here and said, this looks really, really strong and I must be better here. He's right, but Carlsen does have some impressive defensive resources and he fights like a tiger from here. Carlsen now played bishop to d7, connecting his rook so that they defend each other here. Of course, you do have knight to f7 check, but after the king moves here, when you take on d8, the analysis is not over. It seems like you've just won your full rook that you've sacrificed at this point back, and you should just easily be winning the game, but your knight on d8 is actually in trouble. You have rook to c8 here, and the queen is not in a position to defend the knight on d8 indefinitely. Rook c8, now queen takes b6, retreating to the the only square where you can keep defending the knight, and now knight d5 attacks the queen and pushes her away from that defense. So the queen can go to a7 or b7, tough to distinguish between the two. Aronian decides on a7 in the game, and now Carlsen does capture back that rook here on d8. At this point, Aronian starts expanding, getting his pawns going. They're going to be a big factor from this point on, and he plays pawn to e4. Carlsen continues to play resourcefully, and here he goes for queen to d3, not retreating his attacked knight right here, instead seeking counterplay by attacking the bishop. Now, a really nice line here is if you go for not pawn takes d5, but bishop to g5, which is so tempting in this position here. After bishop g5, you're moving the attacked bishop and attacking the rook and the knight here, so it seems like it's just over. Then Aronian would have had, or Carlsen would have had queen takes e4, and after the rook is captured on d8, it's actually checkmating for black after knight to f4. The only way to defend this mate here on g2 is pawn to f3, but then there's queen e2. Again, the only way to defend is rook f2, but now check, forced block, knight check, and after the king goes to the corner, you have checkmate. A very, very nice resource that I think many of us here watching this video or making this video would easily have fallen for. Aronian doesn't fall for this, and after queen d3, he does just go ahead and capture that knight on d5 and give up his bishop on d2. Now we get queen to c7, attacking the rook here and the bishop on d7. To defend both, the queen falls back to g5, tenuously holding on to the rook, but successfully holding on to the rook. And now we get pawn takes on c6. At this point, if we tally up the material, Aronian has 4 pawns for the piece, but his pawns aren't that mobile, so it's definitely hard to convert this. In fact, it's not entirely clear if it's objectively winning, but it's much, much better for Aronian. Really, he should be the only one with winning chances, and it's going to be very hard for Carlsen to defend this indefinitely. In fact, he does go down relatively quickly. We get bishop c8 from here, a great move from Aronian, pawn to h3, very patient. In an attacking brilliancy, you can forget to take time to make left and just cover these details. Now this rook is freed, and that rook is going to be quickly introduced, which is going to win the game for Aronian. Now we get queen to d5, stepping back and attacking this pawn on d4, seeking a centralized position here. The rook comes over and gets ready to lift and defends that pawn on d4. And now we get pawn to e5. Instead, seeking counterplay with something like rook f8 was probably the last defense. Now after pawn to e5, the rook simply lifts, and even though you get this pawn on d4, it doesn't really matter because Aronian has gained enough time to introduce his heavy pieces into a very deadly attack here against the king. Also, now after the queen moves, this pawn is looking to advance to c7. The only defense here was rook to g8, which is a totally computer move, and it still looks really, really good for Aronian after check, and the king has to step up to g6. Would you ever want to do this? I think that missing this for Carlsen is totally unsurprising. It would be crazy to think about a defense that plays rook g8 and king g6. It's so computery, and here you can play both c7 and rook takes d4 with a big advantage. Now, after the move queen to e7, here's where Carlsen made the losing blunder. He pulls his bishop over to f5, attacking the rook, but the rook goes to g3, so there's a mate threat here on g7, and there's also an idea here of mating if the queen or the rook defends from g8. So after rook g3, bishop g6 is the only move, but now queen h4 check wins the game. The problem is that if the king falls back, of course, this is hanging here, and if you choose to block with the bishop, then you have rook to g5 attacking the queen and the bishop, and if you block with the queen instead here, then you're simply dropping the rook here on d8. So Aronian wins the game. His best win against Carlsen, I think, no question, and one of the best wins of all time against the great Carlsen, who just does not lose very much, as we know right now, as he hasn't been defeated in over 100 classical games.